All right, so first and foremost, let's get started with how states manage applications differently. So every state is unique in how they license and regulate cannabis businesses. What we'll be discussing is a breakdown of what we typically see when states announce applications. So I've split it up into two main categories that everyone is familiar with. States that have legalized medical use only and states that have legalized adult use and therefore already have successful medical programs in place. So in medical states, there is usually a statewide limit on the number of licenses to be issued in the state. So for example, Louisiana has a maximum of 10 licenses, Minnesota has a maximum of 2 with 4 dispensing locations each. Ohio had a maximum of 57 retail licenses, and recently, after evaluation of their market, they just upped their maximum to 73 and will have a request for applications out soon. So typically, we see a statewide cap on the number of licenses to be issued. Now, states may break that cap down further into regions like north, south, east, and west, and reserve a certain portion of the total available licenses for each region based off their population and demand. For example, you definitely see or need more dispensaries in and around Phoenix, Arizona than say Globe or Snowflake, Arizona, if you've even heard of those cities. So that's kind of how states will decide how many licenses are held for certain regions. Typically, the state regulating department for the medical cannabis program will announce an RFA, a request for applications, and require that applications are submitted within a certain time frame. So applications are usually only held during specific dates. I've seen states accept applications for a span of 2 weeks. I've seen them accept them for 2 months. Typically, if the time they're going to be accepting applications is shorter, like 2 weeks, they'll make the application available ahead of time to look at on the website, allowing people to do all of the work and preparation and pull the resources together before applications open. So then during that 2 weeks, they really just have to worry about putting it all together and submitting it during those open dates. If they haven't made the application available ahead of time and it is competitive and rigorous, they'll probably accept applications for a couple months instead of weeks. That way, people have a fair amount of time to get all of their necessary items together. So again, this is just what we typically see. Sometimes states have an ongoing need for less popular licenses, such as transporter or processor licenses, and will accept applications for the licenses for a much longer period of time, like how Utah is accepting processor applications until 2024. Or there's, like you see on the screen now at the bottom, Oklahoma. Oklahoma is the only medical market that doesn't have a cap on licenses and is indefinitely accepting applications, low barrier to entries. But due to all of that, their market is extremely oversaturated, and they've even had legislation introduced recently to cut back and possibly put a statewide limit on licenses. So it is for the best that there's that statewide limit on number of licenses, and we'll get into how adult use differs in that way in a second. And that's one other thing I kind of wanted to note back to how Utah is accepting applications for only transporter and processor licenses. Another thing to note is states may accept applications for different license types at different times. So if they do this, they'll usually do cultivation applications first, processor applications next, and then retail and dispensary applications, since that's how the supply chain works. So that's another thing to keep in mind. I have seen states open applications for all types of licenses at once. I think Missouri did that. But usually they try to scatter them to allow the regulatory department enough time to focus on each application process and grading them and awarding the licenses. So that leads me into my next little bullet point here, is how applications are held. They're usually either competitive and merit-based or lottery-based. So if they're competitive and merit-based, a certain number of points will be allotted for each required section on the application. and the applicants with the highest application scores will be successful in receiving a license. If they're lottery-based, applications will still have to meet certain requirements, and then if they meet that minimum barrier to entry, they're entered into a lottery, and license winners are selected by random drawing. So I know that may have been a lot to take in, and you can kind of already see how states manage applications differently, just even within the medical category. But now on to kind of how adult use states differ from medical states. So the biggest difference is that in adult use states, the competition for licenses lies locally. So typically the state will have no limit on the total number of licenses to be issued throughout the state, but local municipalities such as cities and counties are able to ban or limit certain license types and the number of those license types to be issued. So this is why you're going to see lots of dispensaries maybe in Los Angeles, but not in other parts of California, since some kind of more rural areas or more high-end areas don't want that in their area. So again, this is just what we typically see. There are some adult use state outliers like Illinois, who did set a statewide cap on licenses and also allowed for local regulations. That was a little bit of a mess at first. They're still kind of figuring out their application process there too. But yeah, we typically see like California, Colorado, Massachusetts, Maine, Michigan. There's no statewide limit. It's just local municipalities that are able to ban and regulate. And since cities can regulate their own cannabis businesses, they have their whole own application process. So in adult use states, the application process requires you to have obtained a local license first. So it's kind of a two-step process. And since licenses are scattered and limited on a city level, the state is always accepting applications. So for example, in Michigan, you go to the Michigan Marijuana Regulatory Agency and you can begin your application process at any time. The state regulatory department is always accepting applications. However, if you wanted your dispensary to be located in, say, Detroit, you can't really finish your application right now because Detroit city applications are on hold at the current moment. So you could begin your state application, but you couldn't finish it all the way through and open up your shop and get final approval to operate because you also need to apply and get that local license from Detroit. So the main point here is in fully legalized states, competition for licenses lies on a local level. Cities and counties also vary in how they host applications, with it being either competitive and merit-based or lottery-based. So that kind of still, that varies from city to city in adult use states. So that is how a little just recap on a very bird's eye level of how states manage applications differently.